This is Beyond the Big Screen Podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen Podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Hey, it's Steve here. We are going to join Mustache Chris, Frank, and Darryl Cooper again to wrap up this series on the HBO series True Detective Series 1. Frank and Chris have done 5 episodes already, and this will be the last episode where they wrap up episode 8 of this series. They are joined yet again by Darryl Cooper of the Martyr Made Podcast. If you want to learn more about Darryl's podcast and his projects, look in the show notes. In this episode, we'll get into the real meat of episode 8. But I highly suggest you go back and listen to the whole series if you haven't already, because they've built a really fascinating discussion of this pivotal television series. So take it away, Chris.
So yeah, I'll give you guys a quick plot rundown for episode 8. In 2012, the man with scars is shown living in a large house in squalor with a female relative whom he's having an ancestral relationship with. Later, he goes to work painting school and watches children in the playground. Marty and Rust extract details from the sheriff. Gretsch, how are we pronouncing that guy's name?
I think it's actually Garrissey. I think we were saying it wrong before.
Garrissey. Extracting details from Garrissey by showing him the Parthenon tape that we talked about in episode 7. Marty thinks that the green-eared spaghetti monster may have been the scarred man covered in green paint after painting a house in Doria Lang's neighborhood in 1995, showing that Marty, who usually gets the short end of the stick in terms of being a good detective, really kind of cracked the case when he made the connection between the two. That wasn't Russ. That was all Marty. They trace the paint jobs of small business owned by William Childress that employed a man with facial scars. They visit William Childress's home, and Russ pursues the scarred man. Errol Childress through a labyrinth of trees and tunnels that Errol defines as Carcosa. Russ briefly sees a hallucination of a sort of spiraling vortex before he's attacked by Errol. Marty runs to Russ' aid, and they both fight Errol. They're all severely wounded, but Russ manages to kill Errol via gunshot to the head, while Marty and Russ recover in the hospital. Papania and Gilbo connect Errol to dozens of missing persons cases and murders, including Doria Lang's, finding several bodies buried in the yard. The Tuttles escape prosecution, but are publicly disgraced. Marty breaks down in tears when Maggie and his daughters visit him. Afterwards, the two detectives reflect on the ongoing universal battle between light and dark. Yeah, and the opening shot in this episode actually is Childress's house. What did you guys think about the reveal that Errol Childress was? A lot of people took conniption with the fact that he was kind of just like an inbred hick. I thought it worked perfectly.
I thought it worked perfectly with the rest of the story. A lot of my friends, again, who are really into Lovecraft and stuff, they absolutely hated it. That they thought it sort of degraded the monster, and just was, I totally disagree. The whole kind of, again, we talk about the landscape that the story takes place in is just sort of, it's being eaten away at and corroded. The people are being eaten, the communities are being eaten away at and corroded. And you have this guy who's part of this old family that's been there for centuries. It was probably a grand old plantation, family that, with deep roots, probably in Europe and all these things, right? And that over the course of time, at least many of the branches of that have split off and gone through this process of entropy themselves until you get to Errol, who's just a giant kind of schizophrenic, inbred guy. And he's sort of, these rituals or whatever that used to take place back in the old days that maybe, at one time had some sort of grand, some sort of grand rationalization behind them, some grand mythology behind them or something. That now it's just this crazy guy, this crazy inbred guy who's like got bits and pieces of that. And he's just going around like killing people and doing it, again, with bits and pieces of that old mythology, like kicking around, but really with no broader understanding than that, so that you have like, that time is a flat circle scene from the earlier episode, where, Russ just tells him, what is that, Nietzsche? Shut the F up. It's like, shut up. Because that's where it's fallen to. That's where the whole situation has degraded and fallen to.
Yeah, I think it's really kind of a case of, they say don't meet your heroes, because they always disappoint. You admire a particular athlete or author or musician or academic or whoever, politician, whatever it is. And then you meet them, and more often than not, or at least frequently, people are very disappointed in the reality of the person that they met versus the mythology they've created in their own minds. And I think that's what's happened here for the bulk of the viewers. They wanted something supernatural, some of them. Those that didn't want something supernatural still wanted Hannibal Lecter, or something sophisticated and brilliant, like that. And what they got was this, half crazy, guy living in squalor with his half sister, who at best is a mimic, and is able to blend into society because of that skill. But beyond that, he's really just takes advantage of the environment in that there are plenty of people who are vulnerable. There are plenty of disasters that create a greater vulnerability, and he capitalizes on that. It doesn't take a Jack the Ripper or Hannibal Lecter to accomplish that, but that's what people wanted. And I'm with you, Darryl, and I think Chris too, in that I'm okay with it. I think it's actually, this was a series that was grounded in both the reality of our experience as human beings and in reality in general. Like, it's a very grounded series. And this is a very realistic outcome in terms of who the perpetrator is. I mean, they're not all, very seldom is it an arch villain, supervillain, villain, Lex Luthor, whatever, sort of thing. It's more often this, not very impressive individual who's been getting away with this. And so, they say don't meet your heroes. Don't meet your villains, I guess, is possibly an axiom that we need to adopt in these situations.
Well, I think a part of it too that people forget is like, yeah, he's obviously dealing with, he's obviously a byproduct of some kind of ancestral relationship of some sort. He's also high on drugs, right? Like, that's the whole thing throughout the show is like the LSD and the meth that they're cooking up is crucial to all these rituals. So Errol's not even really part of this world, right? Like, he's been taking meth and LSD for God knows how long, right? So, and you hear it when he's talking, like he talks about like the infinite loop, which is like a little thing, like he just mentions that line. It's like, and just in passing when he's talking to his half sister or his cousin or whoever that is, he's like, oh, I'm about to understand the infinite loop, or I'm about to break the infinite loop. So this idea of like this loop, this circle, time being, it's obviously something that was the basis of this cult, religion, whatever you want to call it, right from the get-go. But yeah, like Errol is not, he's not all there, not just because his IQ's low. Maybe his IQ is not even that bad. It's because he's been on drugs for God knows how long now. Let's just say, give or take.
And he was indoctrinated into this cult that is a young child, right? So it's something that's his entire reality. So, I don't even know if he's taking drugs anymore. It's entirely possible that he was subjected to LSD and meth in his formative years, and he uses them on victims now, which, is evidenced by the case. But it could be just, if you look at what goes on with Rust because of his use, LSD stays in the fat cells of your body. You can, a flashback is a real thing. It can happen. And who knows, maybe he, isn't necessarily on drugs now, but he was whacked out on drugs for so long as a young person, and it's having a, prolonged effect on him. I think that's, easily just as likely. And really at the end of the day, pretty much the same outcome, right? Because he's messed up.
There's, there's this ancient pattern you see in humans that, we see something like the rituals that they're engaged in, and it's the devil, right? That's the worst imaginable thing that anybody in our civilization could think about. You go back far enough in the line of just about any human group, and you start to find things that start to approach that, right? You go to like Papua New Guinea, and you're going to find a tribe there. I think there's a tribe in Papua New Guinea where they would do this. And this was as recently as Europeans found them, right? Like we found them and the Dutch, put a stop to it once they kind of had control of the area. But this tribe, one of their big annual rituals was, it was a coming of age ritual for the boys. I think it actually happened every like 2 years or something. They get all the boys of a certain age and they would take them all out into the countryside, and the men would, be dressed up as ghosts and demons and sort of put them through this long initiation ritual. And then they would come back, and one of the daughters of one of the tribesmen who was of their age, about like 10 to 12 years old, would be laid down on this platform, big canopy of big heavy logs over it. And each of the boys would come up and copulate with her. And then as the last boy was copulating with her, as he reached climax, they would pull out these supports and the logs would come down and crush them both. And then they were both roasted and eaten by the tribe. Right? And that's not some kind of like one-off crazy thing. You find, that one's like particularly lurid because of the child sex stuff, but like it's not that you go back far enough, and that is not a crazy, like often left field thing. And so you see that and you think like, okay, so like, let's go up a little bit more civilized than that, right? And you have these ancient civilizations that were, human sacrifice was going on. I mean, you read the Bible, human sacrifice is a huge part of the Old Testament. All the peoples around the Hebrews were all engaged in it. And we know this now, like historically, these people were the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, all these people were engaged in mass human sacrifice. And, the Hebrews were commanded to wipe these civilizations out. But then you actually look at like the Romans and the Greeks too. These Indo-European sort of warrior types who didn't engage in human sacrifice. They, at least by the time we get a hold of them in history, but they engage in animal sacrifice, things like that, and other sublimated forms of doing it. And the Romans, like the people that they had real like holy wars against, like the Carthaginians, engaged in mass human sacrifice. The Etruscans up in the northern Italian peninsula, mass human sacrifice. This was the old, it was all these old civilizations that had been around by that point for thousands of years and had probably kind of like True Detective, like the family in True Detective had really kind of lost the thread of where any of this came from. And now they're just sacrificing their children. I mean, the Carthaginians, would mass sacrifice their own children by throwing them into the fire. Phoenicians would do that, and these things were all wiped out by the Romans, by the Hebrews, by these people who were warrior peoples from the steppe or the desert who didn't engage in that type of thing. And for all of those people, reverting to those ways was the cardinal sin. Like it was the great temptation, reassimilating back into the ways of those conquered people. But it was the great temptation, and it was the greatest sin. And so the Hebrew people, when they're all punished, it's because they start sacrificing their kids to Moloch and all that, just like everybody around them and all the people they were ordered to wipe out. You go read like the Iliad, and the Iliad, like when Achilles is just at the peak of his rage, when he's at the point where just all the brakes have come off of his savagery, because he is, all of the institutions that were sort of put in place to civilize men and take them out of that savage state, right, have been cast off. At the beginning, when Agamemnon lost his prize and he took Achilles, that starts the whole thing. But then as you go through the story of the Iliad, you have like Ajax and Odysseus who come, and these are two good friends of Achilles. And they tell him like, look, the king's willing to like offer you all this stuff to make restitution, which is not just a bribe. This was an institution back then, that if somebody wrongs another person, that you make restitution so that we don't get into some big long blood feud or something that gets completely out of control. There to mitigate that savagery. But Achilles rejects that. And he just continues to reject all these things. And then you have that really interesting scene where Hephaestus gives Achilles his new shield, because Hector's got all his armor and battle gear. And the shield of Achilles does not depict warriors killing people and all these kind of things. It's got like a marriage scene. It's got a scene of two men who are in court, basically like, dispute, like resolving a dispute between themselves. It's these civilized things, right, that are on there. And so he goes in, kills Hector. He defiles his body. He brings him back to, to his camp, props him up in a corner, just his defiled corpse in a corner. And then he takes a bunch of Trojan captives and he sacrifices them, which to the Greeks at the time, even all the way back in Homeric times, would have been like, oh, okay, this is rock bottom. Like he's fallen all the way off the civilized ledge down to like full savagery if he's sacrificing human beings. And so they think of it that way. And the Romans too, the great sort of theme in like Roman history is that, we're becoming degenerate because we're adopting the practices of the people that, that we wiped out, that we knew were wrong. And so you get to the point where, when Hannibal was at the gates of Rome, they sacrificed some humans to like, please bail us out. And, once when Christianity comes along and kind of, takes over the Roman world, all of those old pagan practices, you look at like the Celts and stuff, you have the Wicker Man and like all these other human sacrificial rituals and in Ireland and among the Celtic peoples in the Gauls, all these things were going on. The Vikings had occasional human sacrifice like early on. And Christianity came and suppressed all these practices and just, made it so that, maybe you go find some little village out in the woods or something where something's going on. But in terms of like people who are sort of actors in the geopolitical order at the time or something, that stuff was all suppressed. And when you get up into, the late medieval, early modern period, the 1400s, 1500s, you start to see things like, I'm sure you guys are probably familiar with this, Chris. I know you got to be, the story of Gilles de Rais, the famous knight who fought in the army of Joan of Arc.
Joan of Arc's right-hand man.
Yeah. And after
story.
It's an insane story. And after the war, he goes back, and he's got some money problems because he's really like a big spender and everything. And he's mortgaging off all of his properties and stuff that have been bequeathed to his family estate. And so his relatives go to the king and they're like, can you tell him that he can't do this anymore? He's giving away our legacy. And so he tells them you can't do that anymore. And so he gathers some devil worshippers around him and they start doing rituals in his cellar. And the rituals are there to like basically make him wealthy. Like a lot of rituals are it's just, they want power, they want wealth, like all these things. And you see this theme that goes all the way back to the Phoenicians, all the way back to the Canaanites, all these people. And that you see in something like True Detective, which is for some, and all the way back to those people in Papua New Guinea, is somehow we got this idea in there that causing suffering and doing things that are wildly outside of like the normal boundaries of social life, that will somehow bring us power or bring the things we want into our life. And so, Gilles de Rais and his people, I mean, they were kidnapping children from around the countryside, hundreds of them by their own admission. Over the years, they would send servants out, kidnap children, and they would bring them back and they would do rituals on them, the likes of which you just wouldn't believe, torture, rape, things involving, feces, urine, blood, everything else. And then they would kill the child. And you think, okay, well, what gave humans the idea that like, that would cause something to go their way, like in the world, but it's an idea that has been there since the very beginning, almost, if you look back far enough. And if you look at, and I think like through the through the witch hunts and the Inquisition and all that, all the things that we're supposed to be so sorry about today, all those practices got wiped out again, by the church and totally suppressed again. And granted, like, there were probably some weird old women who lived on the edge of the village who just like to grow an herb garden who probably got unjustly caught up in that, sure. But the point was to suppress these practices that had reemerged, that the Romans and the Greeks and the Hebrews had suppressed, that the early church had suppressed, but they were reemerging. And so the church suppressed them again violently. And that, nowadays, in our more modern age, where it's much easier to be anonymous. It's much easier to stay hidden. All of the old sort of social and religious controls have started to like fall away. You can imagine that ancient enemy sort of reemerging. And, you can look at the family in True Detective kind of in that light. It's like, this is not just some crazy family. This is a legacy that goes back to those people in Papua New Guinea who have never, even Christianity, this, we're so inured to it because it's just been there ever since we were born. But like, if you go to like Japan, for example, and you talk to them about Christianity, I mean, maybe not so much now because they're used to it too, but like you hear about this back in the day, is they were just dumbfounded by the idea that like, wait, you go in and in front of your worship area here is your God, and he is hanging on a cross after having been tortured and then and killed. Like, that is crazy if you just look at it in its raw form. And then you do what? And then you eat a piece of bread and drink some wine that are supposed to be his flesh and blood. Like, you commit an act of cannibalism, basically. But the thing is, like, it's all been sublimated. It's all been turned, because like the process of civilizing human beings over the years, right, is really like a process of sublimating these impulses that people at earlier phases of society, of development, sort of have to enact literally. They have to kill and cannibalize as part of their ritual to get whatever it is that is flowing from that experience. And it's so universal that you have, people in the New World, people in Asia, people in Africa, that you have to say, this is not like something they learned from somebody else. This is something that somehow all of these people came to on their own. They arrived at this place where like this kind of violence and cannibalism and things were something that were desirable and right to do. But then you get up a little bit, you get up like as people start to civilize, and they don't exactly give that up. But what they do is, well, we're going to sacrifice cattle or pigs or something, animals instead. Or you see, like among the Greeks, for example, the in the countryside, like not in Athens or something, but like the old the countryside rites during the classical period, the people would do things like they would have little cakes in the shape of humans, and they would sacrifice those. And then so you're taking this thing that used to be carried out literally. It was just so barbaric, but for some reason apparently necessary. And you don't get rid of that practice exactly. You sublimate it to the point where you do animals, and then maybe you do cakes, and then maybe you just give a tithe, and that's a sort of sacrifice. Or you ritually honor and go through the Passion and the Last Supper and experience that. And that's kind of what civilization is. And as those things start to drop away, then you start to go back into those earlier periods where these things get carried out literally. You know what I mean?
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast and other great podcasts. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors.
People thought it was kind of silly, the reactions that these guys were having to the tape, right? Marty and they thought, oh, it's over the top. Like, who screams at the tape? But like, you perfectly captured what they're watching on tape is literally the worst of humanity captured. Like, we read about it in books, like about the Carthaginians sacrificing children. We read about in books what the Aztecs used to do, right? Which is kind of we were talking about this, how this kind of cult works. I suspect is not much different than how the Aztec cult would work, where these guys would get high on LSD to be able to get in the mind frame.
Aztec ritual. They were all on mushrooms. Yeah.
Yeah. And the sacred mushroom, and to get into that mind frame. And what you're watching is basically, and we had that whole thing about the Old Testament and human beings not listening to God. What these guys are watching on this tape is all of that condensed into, I don't know how long the tape is, right? Marty ends up having to turn it off. Russ watched the whole thing. Let's just say for give or take 20 minutes of the absolute worst of what humanity is capable of committing to one another. And that's the reaction. Like, to me, I would have a very similar reaction if I was forced to watch that tape.
And when you put it in those terms too, it, you try to imagine how, like, the conquistadors, once they came across what was going on in the Aztec lands, like, how are they supposed to react to that? And you can say, well, there's tons of violence in Europe at the time, the Inquisition, too. Yeah, that's all true. But I'm just saying, like, in their social context, like, you come across this. Like, there was this one, like, when Cortez and his men are on their way to Tenochtitlan, they hadn't reached it yet. And Moctezuma, the king, the speaker, is sending out these envoys basically to like give them gifts and tell them like, here, take all this, but just go away. We don't want you here. Right. And so the Spanish are going to exchange some gifts with them too. And so they give them some things. And the Aztecs, I think it was the first time that they met one of these envoys. They come up and the first thing they do is they march up a bunch of captives, like right in front of the Spanish, and just cut all their throats. And the Spanish are like, what the hell is going on here? Right. And like, you know, it's kind of similar. Like you have these Europeans, like when the colonial period took off and they end up, you know, the Dutch end up in New Guinea and the British and the French end up in Africa, and they're seeing all these things, you know, all these things that are in our anthropology books now. And, you know, when you think about like, what would your reaction to seeing that tape be? It kind of throws their reaction, you know, into a little bit of a more understanding light.
Oh yeah, for sure. Right.
It's interesting that you bring up the Aztecs. I just recently listened to a podcast series, that the This Is History podcast, which is pretty good, with Tom Holland and, Dominic, I forgot his last name, but they did like an 8-part, series on the Aztecs and how the cultural differences were such a huge element to what that experience was, and how like, and I really don't need to go on about this because I think you covered it really well, how, you know, as we progress through the civilization process, if you will, you know, we get further and further away from those more base instincts that we had as younger civilizations. And even though the Aztecs are advanced in many ways, in that way, they're still at that stage. And of course, the Spaniards were horrified. You know, coming at this from a non-Christian viewpoint, you know, I would say that if you look at some of the tenets and practices of Christianity without being a part of them, you see some of the same like strangeness to them. Like they would be very strange. Like I think that the Aztecs' response when they learned about the Spanish religion would be every bit as shocked and amazed. And much like you described the Japanese in the, you know, 15 and 1600s when exposed to Portuguese, Christianity. And so like, I don't know how much of a Christian Marty Hart is. I think he's, as we talked about before on the show, on this series, kind of a Christmas and Easter guy at best, you know, meaning that's the only time he probably goes to church. Or, you know, I guess he went through a period where he found religion after he and Maggie almost split that first time. But I don't see him as a deep thinking Christian. Like I don't see him as a super devout Christian. I think he's a social Christian, for lack of a better term, because that is the predominant religion in this country. So it's the path of least resistance in a way. And it's not like it's like the basic tenets of behavior that go along with it are bad. They're good. They're positive. You know, treat other people the way you expect to be treated. You know, don't break the law, respect all, you know, I mean, who can argue with those behaviors? And so it's palatable to go along with it too, not just because it's easy. And I think that's who Marty is as a Christian. Rust can't be a Christian because he can't accept the inadequacies that he sees with that religion. And yet, and we haven't gotten here yet. Obviously, we're still on the opening scene of the episode. We're 2 hours into the episode. But we do see he does approach, I wouldn't say he becomes Christian, but he certainly becomes spiritual, doesn't he? I mean, he certainly by the end of this, when he goes from being that pessimist as a defense mechanism, but also, as Darryl pointed out very, very well, you know, his own consciousness kind of boxing him into that viewpoint as well. He goes from that to at least a cautious optimist, I think, or maybe a relieved optimist in some way, because he experienced something. You know, I mean, we're going to talk about it, I know, but I mean, we might as well talk about it now because really the episode, not a lot happens in this episode action wise. I mean, let's face it. He chases the guy through Carcosa and that's spooky. And honestly, I'm curious, what each of you found to be the spookiest part of his trip from when Russ starts chasing him until he gets stabbed. You know, after his vision, what was the spookiest thing about Carcosa to you? Because I think there's one thing that really creeped me out way more than anything else. And I'm curious if anyone else has that same experience or if something else got under your skin. Chris, how about you? We'll start with you.
Well, I mean, when Errol's talking to him in the tunnel, right, he's calling him his little priest, right? And like right before Errol stabs him, the vision that Rust has is basically a spiraling vortex. It looks like he's seeing the entire universe, or whatever word you want to use.
Or the infernal plane is opening for him.
The infernal plane, right? Like just the entirety of existence, right? And it's spinning in a circle, much like the infinite loop that all these guys have like tattoos of. And they talk about the flat circle. And once you take into account that Errol is like calling him his little priest, I think Errol kind of understands that Russ very easily could have fell into this religion. And I think that was the vision that really scared him, was he's seeing what I believe what these guys see when they're high on LSD and they're doing their worshiping service in front of the Yellow King, which is that dilapidated stick figure that's got like the yellow, yellow tarp on it or cloth
draped on there, yeah,
draped on it, right? Like that's not actually the Yellow King. The Yellow King only comes out when they get super high on LSD or ayahuasca or meth or whatever drug you want to use, right? And in that moment, I think Russ was tempted to be, or at least saw that he easily could have become one of these guys. He could have been like a high priest in this religion. That's the way I interpreted it. And I think that's the way Errol saw Rust, even though he didn't really know him all that well. Maybe he'd read about him in the newspapers. Maybe he kind of followed him around because Rust.
You think that's why he calls him Little Priest?
I do. Yeah, I do think that Errol saw like a potential like disciple in this religion there, and Russ getting, and then he stabs Russ. Maybe he realized that wasn't going to happen
with the Dora Lang knife.
Yeah, with the Dora Lang knife. But I thought that's what that vision was it goes to show that even our hero, quote unquote, Russ, was very tempted and potentially maybe joining this religion. And I don't think that was just like something like people that they threw out there to go, Russ could have been the killer or what have you. But if you cut to the scene where they actually invade Reggie Ledoux's compound, he asks him, why the antlers? And then later on, I believe it's in that episode or the next episode, he actually adopts Reggie saying time is a flat circle. And he starts talking to the two other detectives about how those little girls are just going to be in that room again and again and again and again. And that's the way I interpret it. That's what creeped me out the most, was the fact that Russ, if things had just gone slightly different, could have been right there, running the services for the Yellow King. That's how I interpreted it.
It's what I love about shows like this is that's a super interesting interpretation. And I completely disagree with it, but I think it's awesome that everything you said is supported within the context of the story. Like, I can't tell you you're wrong any more than you could tell me I was wrong about, the opposing view. Well, I guess it's not the opposing view. I was just going to say that I think you're onto something, but I think instead of him being a part of it, I think that what I get out of it is that his quest to destroy them was a parallel path. That's where I land on it. That was, and it's kind of similar, not exactly the opposite, but it's similar. But boy, that's an interesting take, Chris. I think, that is creepy to basically say that, pull the veil back just a little bit on Rust, and you have another Errol Childress, just a more sophisticated one, perhaps. Interesting.
I think the thing that was really fascinating to me about that last scene was, you mentioned the dilapidated Yellow King, which is just sort of like these sticks with a yellow tarp thrown on it or something. The revelation that this is not some big elaborate sort of, religious rite or something. Maybe at one time it was, but at this point, like it's an echo, a faint echo of whatever that was, and a very corrupted echo of it. You talk about, and I promise I won't go off on like a 10-minute rant again, but like, you talk about the Aztecs are a perfect example of like, you go back to the prior Mesoamerican, civilizations, the ones, the Toltecs and stuff that we have some information about. They all engaged in human sacrifice, but there's a lot of evidence that the Aztecs just took that to a completely different level. And it's almost as if, and you get this sort of same idea from like, the Etruscans and the Phoenicians, all of the ancient civilizations of, the classical and Hebrew world that engaged in all these things, that by the time we find them, these civilizations have been around for thousands of years. And whatever was going on back then, like for the Aztecs, at this point, the religion is just human sacrifice. Like that's what it is. It's been stripped of like sort of everything else. The rest of it is just kind of slogans. They've lost a lot of touch because the Aztecs were barbarians who came from like the outside and kind of conquered this area in the Valley of Mexico and adopted a lot of these practices, you know, and took them over. And so it's almost like a bunch of barbarians moving into, you know, into Rome and like walking into St. Peter's Cathedral and being like, all right, we're going to do this religion now. But it's like, you know, it's sort of a, no matter how grand it looks, it's really a form of a kind of a cargo cult, you know, and
it's a pantomime that they're doing basically.
Right. And so all you're left with at that point is the violence and the sadism. And, but you know, again, that's exactly what a lot of people hated about that last episode, but it didn't bother me at all.
Well, the thing that creeped me out is not nearly as deep as what you both have talked about. So I'm going to look like the shallow thinker here. But for me, it was that,
or we're going to look like the pretentious ones.
Well, for me, it was the stack of children's clothing that Marty walked past, and to see all the shoes and the shirts and the, you know, other discarded and dirty and aged, pieces of children's clothing that was just that was far more petrifying to me than if there had been a stack of skulls, or skeletons. It made the point in a much more visceral way. And it spoke to the, length of time that this has been going on. I mean, Errol Childress says in one of the episodes, I think previous episode, about how my family's been here for a long time. Well, yeah, they've been doing evil essentially for a long time. And that was a very smart and chilling way, I think, for either Pizzolatto or Fukunaga, whoever came up with it, to show it in that fashion.
Because it shows the audience, like it alerts the audience to, you know, like a pile of skulls that's a biological phenomenon. Right. What it is, a bunch of young humans have been killed. That's what that means. A bunch of young creatures have been killed. A bunch of shoes and clothes. That's a bunch of somebody's children who have been killed.
Right.
You know,
yeah, personalizes it. Yeah, you're right.
Well, I have like a little theory of like how I think this whole cult kind of ran. And personally, I think there was like almost like two tiers of this cult, right? Like there was like the higher end people, which were like the Tuttles, right? And then there was like the lower end people, which were like the Childresses and the Reggie Ledoux. And the lower end people, maybe not Childress, but people like Reggie Ledoux and his cousin DeWalt, they were responsible for acquiring the kids, for one, for monetary benefit, producing the drugs, obviously for monetary benefit. Once the kids were ready to go, they would have their own fun with them too. And as we saw at the compound, you know, obviously this process wasn't an exact science, right? Because the little boy was dead, but the girl was still alive. They would get them high on the meth and the LSD, and they'd pump them with all this nonsense about the Yellow King and what have you. Once they were all ready to go, they'd give a call and be like, hey, Tuttles, get your friends ready. Let's go. We're going to Carcosa. And then they'd go to Carcosa and they would have their mass. You know, Childress would be leading the way, the man with the scars. That's what all these kids would talking about, right? He'd be the one doing most of the violence. And, you know, these higher up people with all the money and power in the world would watch and maybe sometimes get involved, and people push back. It's like, well, you know, why would they do that? And I go, if you have all the money and all the power in the world, for some people, the only thing you can really that excites you is like the most absolute taboo thing. And people will push against that. But we talked about it. You mentioned Joan of Arc's friend. There's an example that actually happened in history, right? And he didn't just do that all by himself. He had friends that were helping him do it. You know, and even more recent example, Darryl, you did a series on it. It was the Jeffrey Epstein, right? Which is an even bigger conspiracy than the one that's in this show, you know? And then I mentioned earlier something like the Franklin Credit Union scandal is another example, which is, you can push back on the details and what have you, but clearly something was covered up there. And when we talk about the third season, I'll probably talk a little bit more about that. Like this stuff happens. And in some cases, like almost on a grander scale than what's actually depicted in this show. And I think the really twisted part about how this whole cult would work sometimes is I think some of these people were willing participants. That's why Doria Lang was placed the way she was in the very first episode. I think Doria Lang willingly let herself be killed and then placed at that tree with the antlers the way she was, as the cult making its marker.
Never thought
and
about
her
that.
being like almost like a statue, like, you know, like people think like the Virgin Mary, you know, they accuse Catholics of worshiping the, you know, Virgin Mary and the statues and stuff like that, there's other examples, you know, of like statues bleeding and what have you. I think that's what Dorian Lang was, and I think she willingly accepted that. You know, granted, high on LSD and meth and all different types of drugs, and her head pumped full of nonsense from these people, right? So I think that's why there's like the thing with the kids. Well, obviously, we've seen the Parthenon. She was not a willing participant, but I believe somebody like Dorian Lang was a willing.
I think her diary that they recovered supports your theory on her willingness. But here's an alternative theory on the grander part of it. I kind of wonder if Errol Childress wasn't doing the killings he was doing and didn't do the Dora Lang killing and pose her as essentially an attention grabbing stunt, not for the general public, but for those upper echelons of their hierarchy that he wanted to impress, because, you know, he is obviously on, like you said, a lower rung. He's probably one step above Reggie Ledoux and DeWall. And one of the things that makes me think that is he's got his dad in the shed, you know, and I think he's dead at the point that we see him, and his mouth is sewn shut. And I'm not a psychologist, but, you know, that speaks to a certain, you know, like, I'm going to shut you up. And that speaks to him maybe feeling subordinated and maybe not feeling like he's good, you know, like he's getting short shrift from everything. So, you know, it's possible that there's a higher mass that's going on with the little girls and like Marie Fontenot that he's not part of, and that he's doing his own thing at Carcosa. And it's almost like like in early Christianity, there were, a number of different disagreements about what the religion was. I mean, Arianism versus, Gnosticism and all these other ones. And he could have been a splinter group from essentially what they see as the true faith. And now he's trying to impress them enough to maybe get folded in or brought in to the true faith. Now, evidence for this is very scant. This is mostly headcanon for me.
Well, there is one thing I remember when it's a almost an offhand line, but it's said in a way that in a context that I think we're supposed to take it away is basically true, is when Rust is talking about why Tuttle came down to like get into the case and have it reassigned to people he knew and whatever. He said, I think he recognized it. Mm-hmm. And so it's like he, not that he was there participating in or something, but he saw that and he's like, oh, this is one of our people. And that like, maybe
a little off the reservation, then I need to go down and
Well, it's one of these like, one of these inbred, degenerated branches of the family that has like some memory of all this. Cause remember when they talked to that, in I think the 7th episode, they talked to that African-American woman, and she was just like a household servant, and she knew all about this stuff. So it wasn't like some dark secret that like was only kept close to the vest by the patriarchs of the family. There's somebody everybody in their environment was kind of aware of, at least on the fringes on some level. And some of them took it off in their own directions as they understood them, and when you have like and I think it's important that it's not Errol Tuttle. If he had been like a grandson or some other kind of like thing, I think it wouldn't support this as well. But the fact that it's just a different branch of the family that is sort of split off and degenerated, and now they're doing this thing that the Tuttles have their own version of, but it's sort of a much more like direct line from the old practice to what they have now to what this is.
And there's degrees of separation too. I mean, you've got the Childress, Errol Childress and Reggie and DeWall, Ledoux, but there were there's a Childress working at the jail. There is a sheriff who is a Childress. And so if you look at families, I mean, I was a cop for 20 years. I have a brother who I think is still in prison. Family, just because you're part of the same family, I mean, there can be concentric circles moving away from certain behaviors. How far do you have to get before you get to someone as quote unquote upstanding as the governor or senator? I mean, it's a hop, skip, and a jump to that sheriff, and he was corrupt as hell, right? And he's just a couple lily pads away from Errol Childress. And so it's not as separated as we might like to believe. So I think you're onto something though, that when you say he recognized it, I think you're right. I think he came down there to keep it. It's almost like we got a good thing going here and these idiots are going to screw it up. I need to go fix this mess before it gets out of hand.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Because they've been doing this for presumably like hundreds of years and nobody's been the wiser, right? Because these are sophisticated upper class people who are engaged in this stuff very carefully, et cetera. And it all, the reason it came apart is because one of these degenerated family lines got really sloppy.
Well, and it also kind of shows you like the nature of conspiracy too. Like you mentioned, the Thomas Childress was the sheriff, right? And he's the one that got the case all shut down. And then they hire, I'm blanking on his name right now, to replace him, or they gave him a promotion because he helped shut down the case. Garrissey, right?
He gets transferred to the state and becomes a detective there as a tacit reward for his compliance. Yeah.
He didn't know any of this stuff was going on. He's just a dummy, right? Like
he realizes that after he sees the tape, Chris, he is horrified and he basically begs for forgiveness from these two, right? When he talks about its chain of command, right? Like he's trying to get them to give him essentially forgiveness. And now, of course, you might get some for Marty, but you're not getting any for us. He holds everybody accountable. I mean, himself most of all, but everybody else too. So yeah, but you're right. He was not culpable in that. That was not intentional on his part, I don't think.
But it shows you though, like for a conspiracy to like kind of work, it sometimes it just takes like a couple of dumb people getting promotions that they probably shouldn't get and just not asking questions, Like all of this could have been stopped if he's like actually did his job and like looked into, did she actually go with her dad? And if once that was figured out that no, missing, a lot of this that happens years down the road could have been stopped, but he didn't do that. Sorry, Darryl.
One of the things that I think is really difficult for people like us to understand, right? Regular people to understand. To bring it back to like the real world for a second. You mentioned Jeffrey Epstein, right? Jeffrey Epstein, like what he had done in the 2000s, what he had gone to prison for, that was not a big secret. Everybody knew. The upper class people who would have been like running with him, flying on his plane and stuff, everybody knew. It was in all the papers. They knew why he was in jail. He went to jail for, an underage sex ring. Everybody knew that. They knew it to the point that his airplane was nicknamed the Lolita Express. He didn't nickname it. Other people nicknamed it that. So everybody knew what was going on there, right? And so I think to myself, and you all think to yourselves, okay, I'm a billionaire or scientist or something. This dude, Epstein, I've kind of heard of. I don't know a lot about. Maybe give myself the benefit of the doubt. Wants me to come meet him on his plane. I go onto his plane, which is called the Lolita Express. And when I get there, there are half a dozen underage girls who are not related to him. And he starts asking me if I want massages from them and so on and so forth. Like any one of us would commit an act of physical violence against that man on the spot, or we would run screaming out of that place and call the cops, something, right? It wouldn't matter like what they offered. It just wouldn't matter. They could say, I'll give you $1 billion. And like, that's not going to change anything. Like for when you're talking about something, let alone the kinds of things that were on those tapes, that they were watching in True Detective. And so it's really hard for us to be like, well, how all these people, they went on there and there's all these underage girls there and he's asking if they want massages and this and that. And like, why aren't these people having that kind of reaction? And I think that, part of the reason is that, if you come from a social circle where moral constraints and these kind of things are already just incredibly loose and degenerate, where, just look at the high end sort of, the really high end, contemporary art scene. It's just pornography and degeneracy and it's just degradation. It's awful, and you see this in a lot of like contemporary high culture, where you mentioned like when you get up to a certain level in the social hierarchy, the only thing that can really get your blood running at all is just, something that's just far outside the normal boundaries of social convention, and you start asking yourselves like, I'm the whatever level, the top of this high. I wonder if I could do this. I wonder if I could do the worst thing and get away, because what would that say about me? If I can do the worst thing and get away with it, wow, like I must really be, and so if you come from, like I mentioned in the Epstein series, like, I described like that whole spirit cooking dinner where people, the Tony Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager and his brother, who ran the biggest Democrat lobbying firm in Washington for many years. They were going to these parties, I guess, party/dinner/art installation things put on by Marina Abramovic, the performance artist. And they would eat dinner in rooms just with like pig's blood writing like cryptic things all over the walls. And there's pictures. Lady Gaga went to these things, like a bunch of super famous people have all. And so you say, if you just came from that dinner and now you're on Epstein's plane and there's a bunch of underage girls there, it's like, okay, big deal. That's not going to shock you, the way it would shock us. And so that's the way these kind of things get normal.
That's how a cult like this functions. Really, right? Like you pointed out, I'm assuming the Childresses went to these like high-end like art meetings and hung around these types of people, and what was going on in Carcosa was whatever. It was just art. Maybe that's the way they looked at it too. It's like, well, we're just producing art. It's for normal people, it sounds insane, right? But once you start realizing like a lot of these like super really powerful people, like you mentioned with like, and that's not to say I think certain people have a tendency, maybe it's a genetic thing, to kind of gravitate towards like the taboo. But like once you break one taboo and then it leads to another, and then it becomes more and more and more extreme, right? Like people, there's been talks about this in terms of young kids and, pornography addiction, right? Like, and now, when I was like growing up, I used to have to like pause like the horror film to like see the shot, right? Now it's just all available, right? And it just like gets more and more and more and more extreme. It's the same kind of logic, right? Where that is, I'm not comparing to what was going on in Carcosa in the True Detective series, but this is kind of how this works. And a lot of it hinges on, people getting people in positions that are just maybe not like necessary. They're not bad people. They're just not smart. You know what I mean? Right? Like they follow orders.
I don't know if they're not smart. I think they're indoctrinated. I mean, I interviewed a writer. I have a podcast that focuses on crime fiction authors like myself that I interview, and one of them was a woman named Alexandra Amor, and she was part of a cult. It was a very small cult. It was more of a group than a massive movement, but she's very smart. I mean, I was impressed with her intelligence when we talked, and yet she was, indoctrinated into the cult, and it's a slow, pervasive process that happens by. So I don't know if they're all dumb or stupid or whatever, but they're in a state of mind that might as well be because they've been indoctrinated.
Well, one thing I just want to kind of clear up, sorry, Darryl, is that I don't mean the people in the cult. I mean, the sheriff that helped cover this thing up by just not asking simple questions and just doing his job.
Yeah. Or even the major that Russ and Marty were reporting to.
That's more
who kept telling him to drop this case, right? It's like this guy's not looking and being like, oh, there's kids getting kidnapped and killed, and like, I better not deal with this because my buddy's, at Childress. It's none of that. He's just a guy who's like, look, maybe there's something going on here, but it involves the governor. It involves these people, like whatever it is.
I want to make
kids,
colonel.
I got kids I have to feed.
I want to be a colonel.
Even given him more of a benefit of the doubt, though, as far as his character, it's like, look, I got kids. I got a mortgage to pay. I got a wife who needs me to like keep this job, et cetera. And, that is, it's venal in a way, but it's also not, because it's
a very human reaction to acquiesce.
I mean, you can't really call someone's loyalty. Yes. Especially if it can be rationalized as protecting their family and stuff, And so at that point, they're just like, I don't want to know.
And Russ keeps bringing it up, which makes him the problem.
That's why in some ways I relate to Russ in a lot of ways, because I'm like that type of person. I remember like years ago, I think I'd talked about this on the previous episode. I had been talking about what was going on with Epstein like way before everybody else was talking about it. Me and Darryl were talking about it like way before, and I'd be having conversations with people, and they're just like, that was their reaction for the most part. So go, I don't want to hear about it. Like, well, what do you mean you don't want to hear it? Like, are you serious? And then now it's okay to talk, But like at the time, I was like legitimately just getting angry, like Russ is. It's like, what is wrong with you people? Like, what do you like? All these missing people, and like, look, I'm building a case, and they're like, well, you don't have any bodies. And it's, of course, I don't have any bodies. They're missing. I mean,
and it kind of goes back to what Frank was talking about at the beginning, right? As a cop, it's like you cannot be a cop and sit around all day obsessing about all the cases that you're not solving, about all the crimes that are taking place that you're not solving and taking care. You just can't do that. You will not survive as a cop if that's where your mentality is, right? You'll lose it. And so this too is a similar idea. People are like, no, I don't want to know if Epstein, a bunch of these people are, like raping a bunch of kids. No, I don't want to know about that. Like if it was my neighbor, I'd want to know about it maybe, but like, why? I don't want to know about this. I just, I don't need that in my life. And like, it's an understandable impulse, because A, you can't do anything about it. And B, even if you are, well, you talked about, you would get angry. And, like you and I had a mutual friend who, we talked to a lot online, group chats and stuff. And, we both kind of like had to kind of counsel him to like take it easy on the politics and stuff, because he was getting really angry about like the state of the world. And it's like at a certain point, man, you got to like step back and say, look, my primary my primary circle of concern has to be like closer to home, and then as you go out from there, then, you can expand. But again, that mentality is why that major doesn't want this case investigated, why people don't want to know about Epstein.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we get the big confrontation scene, which, I thought was beautifully brutal, the way it was handled. I think it's very fitting for the storytelling that Marty saves Rust and then Rust saves Marty, that they save each other. I mean, I don't think I'm being too pretentious to say I think that was thematically purposeful. And they're just sitting there with both of them kind of waiting for Rust to die when Papania and Gilbo show up. And it's really that this episode is really like two halves, because it's a very different episode once we transition to the hospital scenes after the big confrontation. So before we move to the hospital scenes, is there anything anybody else wants to touch on about Carcosa and the Childress scene there?
I just like the way it was done.
And the hospital scenes, we've actually already talked about these. I don't think there's a lot more to say about them necessarily. I mean, we could, of course, there's plenty to say, but we've already touched on a lot of it. But the one of the things that got to me emotionally this time, and I've seen this program, I mean, oh my God, I must be getting old. I'm calling TV shows programs like that commercial about homeowners turning into their parents, I'm watching my programs. But Marty's breakdown when his family comes to see him, I think that's heart-wrenching. Because he is both growing as a person, and that's been 95 to 2012. What is that? That's 19 years, 17 years. That's a long period of time to finally reach a particular point of maturity that he does. And at the same time, he's also realizing that it's too late for him where this family's concerned. He's lost them for the most part, not 100%, but he's lost what could have been. Like he realizes what he lost and through his own mistakes, which were pretty egregious. And once again, I mean, Woody Harrelson has about a half a dozen very dramatic reaction shots throughout this series. And this is maybe one of the best. I mean, he's got some funny ones too, where he looks at Rust like, what the hell did you just say? I mean, those are great too, but I'm talking about like when he reads the note Maggie leaves him, and when he watches the videotape and things like this. And this scene in the hospital just, it tears my guts out, man. It's as good as Rust's final moments as they are walking away at the end of the scene. For me, it's a companion moment.
Yeah, for some people, it literally takes a hammer to the head. In Marty's case, he took a hammer to the chest, or at least the other head,
a hatchet
or whatever, to the chest to realize what's important in life, And it's at that moment when he almost died, he realizes, and then his family's at the hospital with him, how much he's messed up. And I think that it's at that moment that he is actually truly going to repair the relationship with his daughters and his ex-wife, truly become a new man. It's just,
he becomes his best self. Right there, right? He starts that transition.
I heard somebody say one time that for men, in general, men can't really love except in hindsight. And I don't know how true that is, but I think it's got some truth to it, And like Marty kind of alludes to this over and over in the show. Like, the thing that I needed was right in front of right under my nose the entire time. And that's a feeling a lot of people have who go through, people who get divorced or something, that a lot of times their second relationship is much healthier, much better, and much more appreciated by them than the first one. And at the same time, they appreciate the first one a little bit more than they ever did when they were in the situation, despite how it ended. You see that kind of thing a lot. I think that the final scene when they go out under the stars and they have their little exchange, and Marty kind of tells them that it all used to be dark and now the light is actually winning. And it's slow and it's just the beginning of the battle, but it's actually starting to punch through. Take that back to like kind of the things we've been talking about throughout the episode. You go back to our primitive origins and people were all headhunting and eating each other and sacrificing their kids and all that. That at one time you go back far enough, it was all dark. It was not a golden age. It was all dark. And we've been slowly but surely emerging from that darkness, and that darkness is still all around us, and we're swimming in it. It's most of the sky is that darkness, and it's most of the world.
And we're more aware of it now than ever because of our connectivity.
Right. I love two movies. I don't know if you guys have ever done these two movies, but two movies. One's a book, I guess, that I really have always loved are the movie Life is Beautiful, and The Road, the McCarthy novel. And to me, like they both have very similar themes in a certain sense, right? Where, the Life is Beautiful is about a man and his father, Italian Jewish man and his small, 10-year-old son, during the Second World War, and they get taken into a concentration camp. And the father does not want his son to
experience the horror,
to experience the horror of what's going on around him. And so he invents this elaborate game of this whole thing is actually a big game. Everybody's an actor. And what we have to do is when the soldier comes and tells us to do something, well, then we just have to play soldier and go do it. And it's all a big game. And so the son, he's protecting his son's innocence, in a context that, in real life, but also especially in our specific, post-war, social mythology. Like a concentration camp is kind of it's like hell, right? It's like it plays the role of hell in our social consciousness. The worst thing that can happen. It's the worst place you could be. They're in that place. They're in the worst place that you can be in. And yet the father is able to still extract some purpose out of that situation, even that situation. And that purpose is protecting the innocence of his son for as long as possible, right? And he succeeds in doing that. And in The Road, it's similar, right? You have a father and his small son, and we don't know if there's been a nuclear war and asteroids hit the earth or something, but the whole earth is dead. There's roving bands of cannibals everywhere. It's a big gray, ashy, planet. And it's implied throughout that this is basically the last human generation or last couple. We're dying out and the world's dying out because they're not, people are just, the remaining humans are eating each other for sustenance. And then that's going to be it. And the father and son are traveling together and they have this, I guess you would say, this myth that keeps them going, this dual faceted myth. One is that they have to get to the coast and they don't really know why. They got to get to the coast. That's their goal. And the other is that they keep saying that they are carrying the fire and we have to keep carrying the fire in the world. And so it's if you look at when McCarthy wrote that book, he was it was later in life. It was one of his last books. And McCarthy he didn't have his first kid until he was in his 50s. He had a son. And if you read all of McCarthy's earlier works, Blood Meridian, etc., they are bleak. He doesn't give you any hope at all in any of these books until you get to The Road, right? Where at the very end, there's that little scene where there's the fish with the markings on its back that look like the markings on a map. And there's this little spark of hope that he gives you at the end. And you have to think of that as maybe he couldn't understand. That's something he just couldn't understand before, but now that he has his own son, he understands how, look, we're kind of all in that concentration camp. We're kind of all in that world of The Road. Not exactly at this moment, but to go back to what we were talking about, everybody we know is going to die. We're going to die. So our country is going to fall apart maybe centuries from now, but it's going to happen. Our civilization, our language is going to be forgotten. All of it's going away. Like it's all going away. And so we're all in that place to some extent. And yet something as fundamental as, you know, your love for your child can actually redeem the entire thing.
Well, you mentioned like,
you know?
Sorry, Frank, you mentioned the coast. I mean, in the road, Marty and Russ's journey is pay the debt. They have to pay their debt, right? And by paying it, they get to that place at the end of it where Marty's with his family, and that I think we're going to start discussing Russ's ending soon too.
Well, it's that same piece that I mentioned of that, you know, that policeman's dilemma that, you know, you can't save the world, but you can make a difference here and now, right, in this situation with this person. And that's, you know, that's kind of what McCarthy's saying with the son. And that's what Rust and Marty are doing, I think, by trying to fulfill this debt. And it's interesting that for Rust, it's a precursor. It's his last act on Earth is how he initially approaches it. And of course, he has some visions while in his coma that change his perspective where that's concerned. But it's still the idea that, you know, we can do this. This is what we can do. And in fact, when they're laying in the hospital bed and Rust is like, we didn't get them all, you know, Tuttles and and you hear in the news clip that they play how they, you know, the denial of them being related to this family and all of this. And it's clear that they did not change the world. They did not bring down the grand conspiracy. They did not usher in a new age of beauty and truth, right? And they didn't get everybody. And Marty encapsulates the philosophy beautifully by just saying, no, it ain't that kind of world, but we got ours. And I think that speaks to that idea of, in a world where you can't solve every problem and you can't change the entirety of the world, you know, where your circle of concern is so, you know, can't get too large. You just have to focus on your locus of control and make a difference in that realm. And that's what they did. And that's why I think this is a heroic series, is because they were able to do that despite all the obstacles, both internal and external, that they dealt with.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
Real quick, let me just, I wanted to comment just on what you said real quick, is that, you know, Spengler, he draws a picture of like true nobility. Oswald Spengler, the old German writer, what he thinks of as true nobility. And the image that he calls up is a Roman soldier at Vesuvius who was at his post when the ash came down, still standing at his post because they forgot to relieve him because everybody was fleeing, but he stood his post even as the ash came down and buried the city, and that's how he was encased and died. That's like the mark of true nobility, because guess what? The ash is coming down and it's going to bury your city one way or another. It's going to bury everything one way or another, no matter how nice your life seems. Like the ash is coming down, and your job is to, you know, meet your obligations, pay your debts, you know, to the last moment. You know, another image Spengler conjures is, you know, be those soldiers who are there at the last battle of their civilization as the barbarians are bearing down on them and they're wildly outnumbered with no hope of survival, and everything that they're defending is certain to be destroyed. Stand your ground and go out like a man.
I guess like the last thing is, how do you guys interpret the end? Because I think in the end, Russ finds God. And I'm sure Frank's probably going to disagree with that. But I think in that coma, we spent this entire series with Russ being brutally honest about pretty much everything, about himself, to everybody. So whatever he saw in that coma is 100% true. What he felt is 100% true. He's not lying to Marty about that, obviously, right? And he says that he saw his daughter and he saw his pop or felt them. And it was the greatest joy that he's ever felt in his entire life. It's the only moment that we actually see Russ open up emotionally. He actually breaks down and starts crying. I think he realizes at that moment that time is not a flat circle, right? It's not just, oh, you're just going to go, like you're going somewhere. You're going
That's
somewhere,
a great point.
You know,
That's
and
a
then
great
that
point.
end point is happiness. Yeah.
Your daughter's waiting for you. Yeah. She's waiting for you. Your daughter and your pop are waiting for you out there. And that does imply like a directional journey. That's so true.
And then
I never
even
thought about
with
that.
Marty's comment about, he points out the stars and like, look, the light is winning, right? That implies that eventually in a linear timeline, that the light is going to win. It's not just going to constantly repeat itself. We brought up like Aztec religions, and even you talked about Hinduism to a degree, right? I'm not comparing the two, but in the way that they kind of viewed time is, especially Aztecs, it was like a circle constantly. This is why they had to do the human sacrifices constantly, because this thing was I can't remember, I'm blanking on the god's name right now, but if they didn't do enough human sacrifices, the god would come and like destroy the whole world, and then the whole thing's going to repeat itself. And so this is the way they looked at it. It was, if they didn't commit enough human sacrifices or give enough hearts to this god, this would happen. So this is why the Argo cult mentality, as you guys described it, or the craziness just kept on ratcheting up more and more and more and more, because they didn't really see time in a linear fashion, where eventually, let's just say for argument's sake, they have sacrificed enough human beings that at the end point that this God's not going to destroy this world.
Well, that's kind of the story of Christianity in a way, right? I mean, that a sacrifice came to earth that was sufficient for all time. And, all primitives basically that we know about, have a cyclical, and I don't mean that the Aztecs are primitives. That was a civilization, but like you go back to like tribal peoples and stuff, they all had a cyclical view of time, as you're saying. And it was with the advent of like modern religions, whether they're Abrahamic faiths or, or Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is actually like a really good, thing to mention for that last scene, because it really is about the battle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. And that over time, no matter how it looks now, the forces of light will win. And your job is to contribute to the right side of that battle. I never thought about that point about Russ's experience, but it's a good one.
For me, I don't know if it matters if he was experiencing an afterlife that is synonymous with Christianity or other religions that have a heaven of sorts, or if it was more of that Gnostic return to the universe as a particle of the universe sort of thing. What really I find compelling about this is that whatever or if it was just, let me back up a step, or if it was just his dying or possibly dying brain, trying to anesthetize the last moments of its own existence and be happy. I don't think it even matters for the character, because the beautiful thing about it is that whatever he experienced while he was under, the impact on him was cathartic, and it clearly is going to make him live his remaining life in a very different way than he's been living for the past 17 plus years. And it's allowed him to finally address his grief. And that's part of the reason why I think he breaks down at that point is I don't think he's ever broken down over the loss of his daughter, and to a lesser extent, his marriage. And so, I mean, that's a spiritual event, no matter how you package it, no matter what your belief system is, no matter what how you interpret the specifics of it, whether he experienced nearness to God or nearness to the afterlife, or whether it was purely chemical and electrical, doesn't matter, because the outcome was a wonderful transition for him. And I know a lot of people were like, they didn't like it, but we talked about this earlier in the episode. And I think if you're going to tell a story like this, I think it has to have at least a slightly optimistic ending. I mean, you brought up The Road, Darryl. That's the most depressing book in the entire world, except when you get to the end, it isn't. And I think if you're going to tell a story like that, there has to be a kernel of that at the end. Rust has to look up and see the stars and the darkness and say, no, once there was only darkness, you ask me, the light is winning. And just because he's not still Rust as he was for the majority of it, that nihilistic, pessimistic Rust that we all loved to experience throughout the show, people objected to it, but I think it's the perfect ending for that. I
think that experience also liberated him from, what Chris mentioned earlier, which is, having in your mind every day the idea that girl who was in that room, the girl and boy who were trapped in that room where they were abused at the place where they had the shootout, that they're going to be there again and again and again and again as this all goes around. That that maybe not, maybe Marie Fontenot is out there at peace, where, in the direction where his daughter is. It's not this circle anymore, that, maybe it is over for her and she's at peace now, and all of them are at peace now.
Final thoughts on season 1, 60 seconds or less. Who wants to go first?
Let's see. I'll take a stab. So I think in addition to how well the show's written and how well it's made, and the just great dynamic between, the buddy cop dynamic between the two characters, I think that it does have some really deep themes, which are not, sometimes it gets overplayed in television programs, but all great art, it deals with permanent things, eternal things, elements of the human condition that anybody is going to be able to relate to, so that something could have been made or painted or written 1,000 years ago, and people today can actually read it and feel like I understand these people. And one of the things that True Detective does so well is it gives you two people who are really like the opposite of each other in every way you can really devise them to be opposite. And most people can identify with both of them. And it's because both of those forces, those twin forces, are at war in every single person to some degree. And it does that very well. And I think that's really at the heart of the show, is everybody is in a constant battle every day. And some people are winning that battle, so they might forget that they're even in it. But everybody every day is in a battle against despair and nihilism. If the danger, if you start letting yourself look into the abyss too long and dwell on things that are just simple facts of the world, that, you dwell on them too long, that despair and nihilism are where those things can drag you if you don't have support. Marty deals with it through most of the show, basically through denial, through hedonism, through just being absorbed in the moment and so forth, and not thinking. He doesn't want to think about those things. He gets as annoyed when Rust tries to get him to think about those things as Rust gets when Marty tries to cheer him up and talk him out of those things, right? Because they're both very defensive of their position. And the dynamic between those two is handled better than just about any show I can think of.
Well, for me personally, I think it's you mentioned the timeless themes that are in the show. Like, so rare do you see, say, pop art, right? Because that's what True Detective is really at its core. It's pop art. It's a pulpy detective novel to a degree. Yet at the same time, we've ran like 8 episodes. So, not 8 episodes, but we've done the entire series so far, and we have touched on themes in the Bible. We've touched on themes in nihilism. We've touched on themes in a cyclical view of history and life. These are all timeless things that human beings have struggled with pretty much from the moment of consciousness, right? Even like the first hour and a bit of this episode was us going through the Old Testament and coming to the conclusion that at the end point really is the struggle that Ross has gone through this entire series to get to the point where he is at the end. And that's how I interpret it. And even Frank's interpretation, it's still the same thing. It's just a different way of looking at it. He comes to peace with all the horribleness that's in this world, all the horribleness that happened in his life. And you talked about Job too, right? And that's a big theme throughout Job. How often do you get this on a television show? And on top of it, it's well acted. It's well shot. The conspiracy's very well done. The interactions between the characters, it's beautifully shot. It's got some great action sequences throughout the entire thing. It's enjoyable. You could watch this entire show and skip all those larger themes, and you can walk away from it and still enjoy it, which is brought from, at least when I watched it in real time when it was coming out, that was the vast majority of people. That's how they enjoyed the show. They just kind of enjoyed the well done story of it. Where myself, I enjoyed the fact that they were actually seriously trying to tackle some of these themes. People like the idea of nihilism in the sense because it sounds edgy and cool until they meet somebody like Russ, and it's like, oh yeah, it's actually depressing and you're suicidal. And this is not a cool thing. We all struggle with it, but it's not cool. It's not edgy. It's not something you put on a t-shirt, which is what goes on a lot in our society now. In particular, my generation, it was like a huge thing, like nihilism. Maybe it's different with the younger kids now. I find sometimes when I talk with younger kids and I bring up God and the Bible, they seem to be a little bit more receptive than people around my age. Maybe it's just because I'm older, but I remember growing up, like if you were tried to find any kind of meaning in this world other than like some kind of meaning that you created yourself, or people thought you were like a loser. Like they thought you were crazy. I don't know, maybe it was different in the States, but up here in Canada, that was the case.
No.
And it's just so very rare for a TV show to do this. And should be recognized for what it was able to accomplish, because it is so hard to produce good art in Hollywood and a studio setting. Frank, you've talked about this on previous episodes that we have, for everything to go off just as seamlessly as it did. And it helped that they had the same director throughout the entire series, that the same writer wrote the whole thing, that Matthew McConaughey was so passionate about the project that he literally wrote like a parallel script trying to understand the psychology of Russ himself. It's really insane. And it does not happen very often. You know, you have a few examples of this where something just worked perfectly, right? You know, The Godfather is an example.
You know, Godfather is a great one to bring up too, because the book by Mario Puzo is not a masterpiece. It's just a pulpy mob thing. And out of that, though, that great art was extracted. So just like True Detectives, like at its heart is like a pulpy detective, you know, story. But out of that, sometimes that's where you can, you know, it's when you're not exactly trying to, like, you know, when people come along and you can kind of tell when people have this idea in their head and they're trying to express that idea through this piece of art. It often comes across way too heavy-handed, really clumsy, and just overly ideological. And it's when people are kind of just, they're telling a great story and these themes are being dropped throughout this great story. That's when really good stuff comes out.
Well, you guys really paved the way well, because every reason that you mentioned, both of you, are reasons why I think this is a great, just the best single season of television ever. You know, the writing, the directing, the cinematography, the imagery that they capture on film, the acting that the two characters, all of the characters, I don't think there's a one in the entire, even supporting characters, who didn't absolutely inhabit their characters that are 100% believable. I told Chris early on, I'm a real fan of the construct of multiple timelines being explored, and also the police interview, tactic, or the construct of, you know, framing, a movie through that. I mentioned Mortal Thoughts was a really good example of that, with Demi Moore and Bruce Willis. Just a kind of a fun movie that did that. And you brought up, Darryl, and actually you did too, Chris, that the universality of these themes, how they're so applicable to all of us and we understand them. But I think what I'll focus on is that this is a show that took all of those buddy cop / crime drama tropes and it embraced them, but it turned them on their sides a little bit. It didn't come at them head on and just recycle them. It did turn them a little bit, came at them from a little bit more of an oblique angle. And I like that. And I liked how, and this would be like the third time I've mentioned this, so everybody should be pretty familiar with the concept I'm talking about now, but I really liked how that policeman's conundrum was addressed. I mean, how these two could not change the world. They couldn't even take down this conspiracy, but they could do what they can do. And they had the tenacity to do exactly that. And so when you take that and throw it inside of the comments that the two of you have already made and wrap it all up, I do think you have the single best season of television, not just crime fiction, but of television, period. This is an 8-hour film.
Yeah, you mentioned the film part. There's a part of me that wishes they had just done episode 7 and 8 as a 2-hour long like finale, just because of the way the editing kind of worked, like the way they dropped off episode 7. I just thought it would work better if they had just, like, we're going to do a 2-hour finale, because like episode 7 and this episode is different. You mentioned the multiple timelines. There's no multiple timelines in those 2 episodes. It just kind of lends itself to almost like a 2-hour film. No, I'll just say, like, I hope you guys enjoyed this series, and, you know, it's been a journey, really. It's, believe it or not, me personally, it's helped me kind of deal with some stuff because of Russ's character. I think I messaged Darryl and you guys a couple of times saying, as much as I love this show, it is kind of, it puts me in a weird headspace, because for a big chunk of my life, I was very much like Russ in the way he looked at the world. So it kind of brings me back into that head frame, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It reminds you of how far you've come, right? That's the way that's
what pulled you out of that?
Be honest.
I'll bet it was the same. I'll bet it was the same thing that pulled Russ out of it at the very end. Not the death experience, but his daughter. Well, you know, his
it's
kid.
Weird. It started with, I started reading the Bible again a bit, and then I met my wife. When I met my wife, it was it was just so bizarre to me because here was a person that generally cared about me. It was like almost immediately, like she was interested in wanting to get to know me better. And I would say crazy things to her and just about like the way I viewed the world. And she didn't freak out, you know, and this was like, I didn't say it right off the bat or what. Well, I'm the type of person, you know how guys act differently around girls. They're like, they whatever find attractive. I hated that in high school. It's probably why I never did well with women in high school. I literally act the exact same way around everybody, right? Whether you're my manager or like, I don't put on these multiple masks like Marty does and throughout this show. And that's in a lot of ways is why I kind of relate to Russ, where Russ is just Russ to everybody. So I would say crazy kind of stuff to her and she immediately didn't freak out. And then she was like, well, do you think that's like really like a healthy way of looking at things? And then like just through the process of just kind of explaining stuff to her and then finding, you know, eventually falling in love with her, it really kind of snapped me. It really kind of snapped me out of it where I started realizing, hey, it's not everybody else's job to try to get to know me better or try to understand me. I have to actually open myself up to other people and explain myself to other people for them to actually even come and try to talk to me.
Shed a little bit of your inherent narcissism right there, right? Like you're socially, that narcissism that's like a blanket that we all get put on us, you know, that.
And it was a slow process, right? It didn't happen overnight. And I remember when we found out that my wife was pregnant, I freaked out. Right. Not in the sense of like, oh, I'm having a kid or something like that. I freaked out because I was like, oh, I knew how I grew up. And I was like, I did not want this child to go through anything that I went through. I was more concerned. It was more just concern. Like I want to make sure that she did not go through what I went through. Right. So I probably didn't enjoy the first pregnancy as I have 2 kids as much as I should have. And there was a moment where like I broke down and my wife we were just, you know, working through stuff. Right. And I think it was in that moment when I realized like, I have to break out of this. Right. It's because it's not just about me anymore. Right. It's about my wife and then this child that's coming into this world. And I think there was the moment when we were both in the car and it was at that moment I was like, no, because if I keep on thinking this way, eventually I'm going to imprint this on my child because they end up taking it up after most children will take up after their parents. There's a reason why most kids end up doing the same job that their parents do or something very similar, right? Because they look up to their dad, they look up to their mom, right? And then that was the moment I was like, no, I have to actually fundamentally change how I look at things. And, you know, me and you, Darryl, we've been chatting for 8+ years now, and I've changed. You know, I'm not the same person I was when me and you were first chatting, you know? But it took 8 years.
Yeah, you don't have to be a Christian to understand the great Christian theme, which is, you know, that love is what redeems the world. And you go through your life without it, the world's a pretty bleak place. You
It's the anti-I, though.
Hey,
it's the anti-me.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep. And, you know, you experience love, and it doesn't necessarily make the world any less bleak, but it makes it more bearable. That's for sure.